Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Michael Dobberstein. Michael is a professor of English at Purdue University Northwest. He's also a poet, and our subject today is, what is the good of poetry? We spent a lot of time sorting that title out, so we'll make sense out of this in a minute. Just a little more background on Michael. He studied English at Southern Methodist University and took his PhD from the University of Utah. Two of his areas were Romanticism and Modernism, and he's been published in Poetry Magazine. And we're ready to go here, Michael. So where would you like to start? We're talking about what is the good of poetry.
We're talking about what is the good of poetry.
Yes.
And I'm referencing a conversation that you and I had a few weeks ago about this subject. What is the point of studying poetry, or liking poetry, or that? So what I thought I would do is talk about, Wallace Stevens, a famous modernist poet, had something to say about what the poet's role was and what good poetry could be. So we'll take a look at what he was saying, and then maybe take a look at some poems to see if we can kind of sort out why anybody should pay any attention to poetry at all. All right?
Okay.
Okay.
And we're not saying that people should pay attention to poetry. We're talking about if they want to pay attention to poetry, right, what they will get from it, right?
Something like that, yes.
Because we're not,
yes.
Okay, good. So,
Wallace Stevens has actually a very broad claim to make for why we should pay attention to poetry.
Okay.
And although, I've been studying poetry, gee whiz, for a good part of my adult life, I'm very bad at remembering poems, so I have to read a lot. So I brought these books.
Great.
So I can read some poems, and we can talk about what makes them good and why we think we should read them. So Wallace Stevens, way back during World War II, actually, wrote a series of articles that he published in this book called The Necessary Angel. Wallace Stevens wrote a kind of poetry that people thought was very elitist. And people were always asking him to, because he was a famous guy, right? Famous poet, World War II is going on.
Yeah.
They were asking him to justify poetry in a world which had gone violently crazy. Here's this terrible war going on, millions of people are being killed. So people are asking Wallace Stevens, how can he justify something like poetry? How can we continue to do something like read poetry and appreciate it when all this terrible suffering is going on? So Stevens had to think really hard about what the function of the poet was. So he didn't address directly the whole idea of poetry in a time of terrible suffering. He sort of talks about it indirectly. And he says the function of a poet, he says, is to make his imagination theirs, that is, other people's, and that he fulfills himself only as he sees his imagination become the light in the minds of others. Only as he sees his imagination become the light in the minds of others. And he sums that up by saying his role, in short, is to help people live their lives. So that's what poetry is for, is to help people live their lives.
Okay, several things going on conceptually there. This light in the mind of others, I mean, that's sort of a description of the sublime, would you agree?
It could be.
Yes. And he uses the word function there?
Yes, the function of the poet.
So this gets to a bigger issue, which is what I think we were talking about the last time we discussed this, and that is this notion that poetry has a function. Is this all because of Shelley's argument that poets, were sort of the legislators of the culture in a sense? Right?
Well, what Shelley said was that poets are the unacknowledged legislatures of the world.
Definitely unacknowledged.
Legislators, yes, unacknowledged.
But his word, by world, he meant culture,
everything.
I would assume.
Well, he meant everything,
Western
yes.
culture, yes. That's an interesting comment for him to make, and I can see his argument there, because I think that poets explore things that the rest of us take for granted and maybe get us to look at things in different ways and cause us to expand our sense of who we are and where we're going.
Well, you might notice that Wallace Stevens has scaled that down quite a bit.
But he still uses the word function. And my problem with Shelley and with Wallace Stevens is that they're making poets out to be laborers in the, in the factory of human experience. And you know, I just think part of what makes a poem is that it doesn't have to exist in the first place. It's just
true, I
Yes.
suppose. But everything that's written has to have a purpose. People write for a purpose. They want, and they want an audience, and they want to have some kind of impact on the
Yeah.
audience.
Okay.
And besides, as I say, he's trying to defend the world of poetry against all those people who are saying poetry can't exist in a time of great suffering. It has no purpose. It has no reason at all.
Yeah.
He is trying to make it a connection here between imagination, which he says, well, let's look at one other thing that he says.
Well, I'll forgive him the word function. And we'll,
Okay, I wouldn't get too hung up on the
Okay,
word
all right, okay.
function. He says the poet creates the world. He creates the world, okay, to which we turn incessantly, and without knowing it, and that he gives to life the supreme fictions, without which we are unable to conceive of it, excuse me.
yeah.
So the poet creates, with his imagination, this world of supreme fictions, without which we are unable to conceive of it. We can't conceive of the world without these supreme fictions.
Right. Okay, and I don't think that's all that inconsistent with what Shelley was saying.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's saying something in a much lower key.
Yeah.
Not quite as triumphantly, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
Now, one of the things you mentioned as you were introducing this is that Stevens was accused of being elitist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how to take that because there are a couple different ways I could apply that to poetry. But in one sense, my favorite sense is that that poets get to write about things that nobody else necessarily understands, and the burden's on the part of the reader. At least some of us feel this way, to learn more about it in order to appreciate the poem, if that's what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean elitist in that sense, or?
well, he talks about that.
Yeah.
He talks about that. He says, the poet will continue to do this, to address himself to an elite, even in a classless society, unless perhaps this exposes him to imprisonment or exile, which it did in Russia, and he mentions what happens to Shostakovich in Stalin's Russia. He will nevertheless still be addressing himself to an elite, even in a classless society. For all poets address themselves to someone, and it is of the essence of that instinct, and it seems to amount to an instinct, that it should be to an elite, not to a drab, but to a woman with the hair of a pythoness, not to a chamber of commerce, but to a gallery of one's own, if there is enough of one's own to fill a gallery. And that elite, if it responds, not out of compliance, but because the poet has quickened it, because he has adduced from it that for which it is searching in itself, and the life around it in which it had not yet quite found, will therefore do for the poet what he cannot do for himself, that is to say, receive his poetry. So the poet always writes for an elite, but not a economic elite.
Right. Right.
It's the elite of people who share his desire for an adventure of the imagination.
And this is, in some ways, the opposite of what we teach students in a rhetoric class, for instance, where if you're giving a speech, you need to identify sort of the common denominator in your audience,
Right.
and try to approach that. And of course, the good part of that is you're getting your message out to more people. The downside of that is that the more you homogenize the message, the less significant what you have to say, probably,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you're less focused. And so, would we say then it's the nature of poetry to take arguments, make observations that are more subtle, so subtle that they can only be made to a small audience of people who have certain common experiences?
Well, perhaps, or the poet wants to share an experience. One of the things that poetry does that's really different from other kinds of literature is that it doesn't depend entirely on narrative. There's often a narrative or scenic base behind a poem, but often the poet is trying to share an experience, to talk about an experience, to use words to express experience, or to recreate an experience that he himself may have had that doesn't depend on all the things we connect with narrative, such as character, or even although scenes can be really important. There's no story as such that for us to connect to, and that often I think that's one of the reasons that poetry isn't as popular as, well, novels or, movies
Right.
or plays. People like stories. They love stories.
Yeah.
And there often is no real story behind a poem.
Well, and often they don't care if the stories are well written, it seems to me. And I think that someone who's reading the poetry cares very much about how the poem is written and less about perhaps what it's about.
But you'll notice, or at least I've certainly noticed, because I've taught a lot of poetry, that people have to be educated as to how to read a poem. And that's one of the hardest hurdles to get over, is to stop reading for a story, to stop reading for what happens next, or to stop reading for plot, or to stop reading for character, because there may not be any of that at all.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example from Stevens.
Okay.
This is a story about, it's a poem about the imagination.
And
Because,
we'll probably take the break after this one, so go ahead.
all right, whatever you want. You tell me
Okay.
when, it's
No.
not very long.
That's good. Go
But
ahead.
I'm going to introduce it a little bit. Is that all right?
All right.
All right. Stevens was a very imaginative fellow, and he had different ways of talking about the imagination. The title of this poem is The Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour, which is the kind of title that most people are going to scratch their heads over. The Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour.
Okay.
Now, there are words there that I suppose only elite people like you and me would understand, right? Like soliloquy
Yeah.
and paramour.
Yeah.
But he's talking about the imagination as a kind of interior lover.
Right.
Okay. So here's the poem. Light the first light of evening, as in a room in which we rest, and for small reason, think the world imagined is the ultimate good. This is, therefore, the intensest rendezvous. It is in that thought that we collect ourselves, out of all the indifferences, into one thing. Within a single thing, a single shawl, wrapped tightly around us, since we are poor, a warmth, a light, a power, the miraculous influence. Here, now, we forget each other and ourselves. We feel the obscurity of an order, a whole, a knowledge that which arranged the rendezvous within its vital boundary in the mind. We say God and the imagination are one. How high that highest candle lights the dark. Out of this same light, out of the central mind, we make a dwelling in the evening air in which being there together is enough.
Very good.
It's kind of an elegiac poem. It's not the kind of thing that Stevens' poetry, he wrote a lot of poetry in his long life. He died when he was 70.
Yeah.
That's not the kind of poem that's often anthologized. Earlier poems that he wrote are anthologized.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to have to look at it again. We're going to take a quick break. The Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today is Michael Dobberstein, and we are continuing our discussion. We decided not to talk about the function of poetry. We're talking about what is the good of poetry. Michael, where do we go from here with this?
Well, let's talk a little bit about how imagination can transform the world.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
Let me give you some more examples.
It just seems like it's such a burden to put on the imagination to make
To
it do
transform the
that.
world?
Yeah,
What else,
especially with
what,
a
what,
with a
what else
poem.
should the imagination do?
Okay, no, that's okay. Yeah. Well, it does. It does transform the world. I'm not denying that.
Well, the poet wants us through words to see how the imagination can transform the world.
Yes.
I suppose everybody has an imagination, but not everybody is going around transforming the world.
Right.
But the poet, certainly Wallace Stevens and other poets too, want us to see the world, the ordinary, everyday world, in a different kind of way. And poetry helps us to do that. And by helping us to do that, as Stevens says, it helps us to live our lives. Because it shows us something that we had not seen before. And it does that through words, which everybody uses. Everybody loves to talk. We know that because all of our students run into each other in the halls looking at their cell phones. At least they run into me occasionally. Everybody has a phone, right? So it's clear that people certainly love to talk. And poetry is all about words. Let me give you another example of how the imagination, through a poem, can transform the word.
This is
Robert Pinsky, who is a former poet laureate. Pinsky visited here several years ago.
Oh.
He's a well-known poet, contemporary poet. He's still around. I met him and talked to him. In fact, he wrote a little thing in this book for me. He's a very nice man. This poem is called The Want Bone.
Okay.
Now remember, we're talking here about how imagination can transform the world. Pinsky is from the coast of New Jersey. I think it's Long Branch, New Jersey. So he grew up on a coastline. This is a poem about a shark's skull washed up on the beach. It's called The Want Bone. The tongue of the waves tolled in the earth's bell. Blue rippled and soaked in the fire of blue. The dried mouth bones of a shark in the hot swale gaped on nothing but sand on either side. The bone tasted of nothing and smelled of nothing. A scalded, toothless harp, uncrushed, unstrung. The joined arcs made the shape of birth and craving, and the welded open shape kept mouthing, oh. Ossified cords held the corners together in groin spirals pleated like a summer dress. But where was the limber grin, the gash of pleasure? Infinitesimal mouths bore it away. The beach scrubbed and etched and pickled it clean. But oh, I love you, it sings, my little, my country, my food, my parent, my child. I want you my own, my flower, my fin, my life, my lightness, my oh.
That's great. His imagination is raining meaning down on
Yes.
the shark bone, isn't
Yes,
it?
it is, indeed. It's transforming the shark bone into something, quite remarkable and a little bit mysterious. But then, the things of the world can be very mysterious if you look at them long enough. So that mysteriousness is part of, I guess, you might say, the quality of the bone that the poet wants to make apparent.
And speaking of Shelley, I couldn't help thinking of Ozymandias as you were reading that, because it's a man-made object, but it kind of takes you through that same progression. It's
except that
on the
Ozymandias,
sand, it's,
but Ozymandias is a cautionary poem.
Yes,
You
there's
know,
that meaning's
the
not here,
greatest things in the world are going to crumble and be covered up by the sand.
Yeah.
This is there's something else going on with the want bone here. Just the title, the want bone, not the kind of words that you would normally find together, the want bone.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that interests me most about poetry, especially really good contemporary poetry, is that the poets juxtapose words that normally you wouldn't put next to one another, and they come up with these new meanings or contexts for them. That's almost a requirement if you're writing poetry today, isn't it?
Well, almost. But the same kind of thing can happen with very ordinary circumstances. In fact, they can be very, very subtle, much subtler than Pinsky is. This is a poem by Jared Carter from his first book called Work for the Night is Coming. Jared Carter is an Indiana poet, a man about my age, lives in Indianapolis.
Okay.
And he writes about, he made up this little county. He grew up in central Indiana. So he made up this county called Mississinewa County.
Central Indiana wasn't strange enough that he had to make up his own county?
No, there's a Mississinewa River. But he made up a county called Mississinewa County.
All right.
And he writes about things that happened in this county. So this is a very, very short poem. I love this poem, and so I often read it in one of my poetry classes, my creative writing class, and it completely mystifies my students. They don't get how this could be anything more than just, not much of anything.
Okay, try it out on me.
So it's called Mississinewa County Road. When you drive at dusk alone, after the corn is harvested, the wind scatters bits of dry husk along the road. A farmer has draped a groundhog's carcass across the corner of a wire fence, and the crows have pecked out its eyes. Your headlights show these things to a part of your mind that cannot hurry, that has never learned to decide. While the car goes on, you get out and stand with the chaff blowing and crickets in the grass at the road's edge. In the distance, there is a dog barking, and somewhere a windmill turning in the wind.
That's great. That's great. I love that. So the car drives on, and the person's imagination is still standing on the side of the road, looking down. That's great.
Because the part of himself that cannot decide, that has never learned to decide.
What's the oh gosh, the Strand's poem about the pregnant.
That's not Strand. That's William.
Oh yes.
William Stafford.
William Stafford.
I have
Yes.
that poem.
Oh, great poem. Yeah.
I have that poem. You want to hear it?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do two side of the road poems in a row here.
All right. This is actually I put these poems together for some class that I taught,
Yeah.
and then suddenly I realized that they all had a certain kind of theme in common, and that is that they were poems about the transfiguring power of the imagination under very ordinary circumstances.
Yeah.
The poem you're talking about is called "Traveling Through the Dark."
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And notice the evocative power of the words "traveling through the dark." The darkness, not just of the night, but of course the darkness, perhaps the moral or spiritual darkness that could surround any of our lives.
Yeah.
Traveling through the dark, I found a deer dead on the edge of the Wilson River Road. It is usually best to roll them into the canyon. That road is narrow. To swerve might make more dead. By glow of the tail light, I stumbled back of the car and stood by the heap, a doe, a recent killing. She had stiffened already, almost cold. I dragged her off. She was large in the belly. My fingers touching her side brought me the reason. Her side was warm. Her fawn lay there waiting, alive, still, never to be born. Beside that mountain road, I hesitated. The car aimed ahead, its lowered parking lights. Under the hood purred the steady engine. I stood in the glare of the warm exhaust, turning red. Around our group, I could hear the wilderness listen. I thought hard for all of us, my only swerving, then pushed her over the edge into the river.
I love how you first did them as the group.
Yes, the
You
group.
know,
And the wilderness
the
listens.
dead doe and the fawn.
The wilderness listens. I could hear the wilderness listen.
Yeah.
What is he going to do? The wilderness is saying or asking itself.
Yeah.
And he throws the carcass into the river.
Right.
Because it has to save people first.
Right. Right. Yeah. Interesting parallel poems there, because on the one, the driver, at least in his imagination, is left on the side of the road, and the other one, the point is that he gets back in his car and drives off.
He does. He does. He saves the other people who might be driving on the road.
So
this is a
one
poem
takes
about
the practical approach, and the other one
Yeah.
follows his imagination.
Stafford's poem is about a moral choice. You choose the wilderness.
Yeah.
You try to get the fawn. What do you do? Deliver the fawn by cesarean? I don't know.
Yeah.
Or you get just push the poor dead doe off the road,
Yeah.
so nobody else will crash.
Yeah.
But Carter's poem was really interesting because it's not really about anything, and that's the kind of poem because this is what you were getting.
It's just
at.
about that atmosphere.
It's
Yeah.
just about that atmosphere because the poet, the man, it's not wilderness. It's just a bare farm scene. It somehow transfigures him,
Yeah.
and he has to stop and just kind of be there for a moment.
There are also good examples of that reference that you gave us that Stevens made to kindling the light and others.
Yes.
I forgot how he put it exactly. but
Kindling the poet's light in the mind of others.
Yeah.
That's what these poems want to do.
They certainly do that, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, the one that I was familiar with, and then the one that I just heard for the first time. I mean, both of those, I feel like I've been there. They're part of my experience. In fact, there are things that I did yesterday and today that are totally gone from my memory, probably. But those very succinctly delivered images, right? They're embedded somehow.
So
Yeah.
so Stevens is right. Poetry helps
Yeah.
you to live your life.
It does, but it's very dependent on the language that's used,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I think that part of what makes them so resonant is the word choice, and more important than that, maybe the words that are left out,
Yes.
because those images come to you almost in a rush. They're describing something that happens slowly, but it's coming to you in a rush.
Poets have different, sometimes wildly different ways of stylizing language. Even though, not all lyric, we're talking here about a specific kind of poetry, lyric poetry,
Yeah.
which for one thing means relatively short poems. But lyric poetry often dwells on, some little moment like that, and talks about how the imagination has transformed that moment. Sometimes they're very ordinary kinds of moments that the poet remembers.
Yeah.
And let's, to talk about the notion of language for a moment, one of the things that makes poetry special is that the poet, if he's going to be any good, has to figure out what his relationship to his native language is. Right. And he has to try and use that language, sometimes transform the language into a way that gets at what he wants to say. Yeah. Eliot famously thought that language should be dislocated into the poet's meaning, if necessary, which is, I suppose, Eliot's justification for a kind of poetry that many people found famously difficult.
In the sense that things were bending in directions I didn't expect them to bend in, and going places that I didn't anticipate. Well, that was a good start. I think we'll have to pick this up again at another time. That's all the time we have for the program today. I want to thank Michael Dobberstein for joining us. And thank you for joining us on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.
This is from William Wordsworth's The Prelude. And in the frosty season, when the sun was set and visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blazed, I heeded not the summons. Happy time it was indeed for all of us. To me, it was a time of rapture. Clear and loud, the village clock tolled 6. I wheeled about, proud and exulting like an untired horse that cares not for its home. All shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice in games confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack loud bellowing, the hunted hare. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle with the din. Meanwhile the precipices rang aloud, the leafless trees and every icy crag tinkled like iron, while the distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy not unnoticed, while the stars eastward were sparkling clear, and in the west the orange sky of evening died away. Not seldom from the uproar I retired into a silent bay, or sportively glanced sideway, leaving the tumultuous throng to cut across the image of a star that gleamed upon the ice, and oftentimes, when we had given our bodies to the wind, and all the shadowy banks on either side came sweeping through the darkness, spinning still the rapid line of motion, then at once have I, reclining back upon my heels, stopped short, yet still the solitary cliffs wheeled by me, even as if the earth had rolled with visible motion her diurnal round. Behind me did they stretch in solemn train, feebler and feebler, and I stood and watched till all was tranquil as a dreamless sleep.